Hi everybody, Cerebrosana in Paris. The video today is about Bill Gates and what he did or didn't say.
I most definitely told you.
You did not.
Yes, I did.
You did not.
Yes, I did.
Didn't.
Yes, I did.
Didn't.
Yes, I did.
During the interview that he gave with Chris Anderson, who's the owner and, as they say, curator of the TED Talks. The subject of today's video is to show you how Bill Gates gave an interview on the TED channel, which you can see right here. Here's the TED channel. They have over almost 17 million subscribers. And you notice that the length of his interview is 51 minutes and 50 seconds long. You see that there's other people who've uploaded that interview with him, and it's almost an hour and 4 minutes long. And this is just someone who uploaded the video. The reason I'm showing you this today is because when TED posted the interview with Bill Gates, somewhere at the end of March, they edited and they removed things that were said.
I most definitely told you.
You did not.
Yes, I did.
You did not.
Yes, I did.
Didn't.
One of the things that was removed was the very controversial phrase about how Bill Gates is essentially saying that we are going to end up with a digital immunity proof. This will be a tool that will be used to restrict your ability to move around as a free citizen. So that was a very controversial thing for him to say. It's probably one of the reasons why they chose to edit it out. So I was just curious to see, well, what exactly else did they remove? So I went and I got both versions of the interview. I just resynced the two videos, basically, because you've got one video that's an hour and 3 minutes long, and then you have another video that's 51 minutes long. So when you put them both on the timeline, they're obviously not synced. So I synced all the audio, which you can see here. We can just zoom in a little bit so you can see this better, right? This is my audio track. These are the video tracks. These are all the gaps of things that they took out. We can just go through this. Every place that you see a gap is text that was missing. So I went and I literally transcribed, which you can see here. I literally went and I transcribed all of the sections that were taken out. Okay, so I transcribed everything, then I came back in here and I put them on the screen. So basically what you've got now is you've got the two versions of the interview with it reconstructed with all the missing parts. Now I can say that at the end, for example, there's a couple of minutes at the end where Bill Gates has finished his interview, he's gone, and it's just the two presenters saying, oh, who's coming up for the rest of the week? I'm not really going to fault them for editing that part out, but I'm just saying all the other parts, there's some interesting things that he says that aren't there anymore.
I most definitely told you.
You did not.
Yes, I did.
You did not.
Yes, I did.
Didn't.
Yes, I did.
Didn't.
Unless you go onto some unknown person's channel and you can find the original version. So you have on the left side the original video, so you can see they're absolutely synced here, and then there's a section that was removed, which again I can say at the very beginning she's presenting, you know, the interview that's coming up, etc. So she's just setting the stage. This was a live interview that they did on Facebook, so again I can understand why they might have taken that section out. But if we move ahead, for example here, and I indicate the speaker, right? So here, this is a removed section. This is a big section that Bill Gates said, but is no longer saying in the official TED version. Because again, it's the official version, which is here, right? This is the official version, and it's the edited version. And if you have a keen eye in watching it, you can see when they've put a little transition, because they put like a little dissolve, and you can see that, you know, the shot has changed, or maybe the sentence, because there are a couple of edits where they cut him mid-phrase, mid-sentence, so it's kind of the sentence doesn't make any sense. But right there you could say, in the editor's mind, it's not going to shock anyone, because listening to Bill Gates ramble on, his sentences rarely make sense. His sentences begin here, they go off there, and they come and they end somewhere, and you're just left with, what did I just hear? And I have to say, I never really, until just this, you know, these past few weeks, I had never taken precious moments of my time to sit down and listen to the man try to express himself. So I have been stomaching him these past few days, and I'm left in awe of him. What is his problem, people? Who taught this man to speak? Does he have issues? Are the neurons not firing correctly? There's something odd about the way the man speaks. Did he do a deal with Elon Musk? Does he already have the chip in the head? I mean, I just don't understand it. And just listening to him, at the end I was just, and plus I'm trying to transcribe him, so I really had to listen to every that the man injects. And I put them all in there, cause you could give the test, you know, like, I literally wanted you to see how this man speaks. So, we all make sacrifices in life. I made sacrifices of my own personal sanity to bring you this interesting video. At least I think it's an interesting video. But I was left at the end thinking to myself, why does this man get all this attention? Why is he even taken seriously? Anyone who speaks that way, would you want to give him your trust? No, he does not inspire trust. He does not inspire intelligence. He does not speak articulately. He just has the money to buy himself presents everywhere. Presents, E-N-C-E, not presents like happy birthday presents. I also inserted in the text every time he laughs, because there are moments where he's laughing audibly and you just think, gee, that's not funny. And yet he thinks it is. Right? Here the phrase was, recovered people are kind of magical, and he's laughing. All right, so I went through and I transcribed literally word for word what he said. And then I resynced everything up here, and I put it all into the video for you so you can see exactly what was said. Here you can see clearly, you know, they're synced. Everything is synced. And then we get to a big section where there's something missing. I've given you the text of what's missing. Following this introduction, you're just going to have the entire video right there that you can go through and watch. And I hope you'll leave your thoughts below, as always, and that you'll like and perhaps share this video. And I think people need to see, why is TED hiding some of these comments that Bill Gates made? Let me just play this little section for you, where he utters the infamous phrase.
Now, we don't want to have a lot of recovered people, you know.
Did you hear that, first of all? Let me play that again for you.
Now, we don't want to have a lot of recovered people.
We don't want to have a lot of recovered people. Interesting. And that comes right after a whole big section that was taken out, which is this. So, which you would think that if this is a real disease and that if you can develop immunity to it, that would be a good thing. Right? You don't need a vaccine. Kind of like when you get the chicken pox. You get natural immunity to it. So here you can clearly see, let me just zoom in again. Here you can clearly see at this section that he's asked the question and then the answer has been edited. So let me just play this for you.
The immediate need is for testing for the virus. But is it possible that in a few months' time that there's going to be this growing need to test for these antibodies in people, i.e. to see if someone had the disease and recovered? Maybe they didn't even know they had it. Because you could picture this growing worldwide force of heroes, let's call them heroes,
Heroes, here we go again. Every crisis has to have its heroes.
Who've been through this experience and have a lot to offer the world. Maybe they can offer, you know, like blood donation, serum donation, but also other tasks. Like if you've got overwhelmed healthcare systems, presumably there are kind of community health worker type tasks that people could be trained to do to relieve the pressure there, if we knew that they were effectively immune.
Right, so he's asking if we have these people who are known to be immune, perhaps there are jobs that they could be doing, you know, that would be lower risk for them.
Yes, until we came up with the self-swab and...
The self-swab, have you heard this? The self-swab. He mentions that they've come up with this new way to swab your you know, to get a sample to test people. It's the self-swab. Now you stick your own Q-tip up your own nose.
Showed FDA that that's equivalent.
And listen to what he says here. He says that his people developed the self-swab, and he and his people proposed it to the FDA.
Swab and showed FDA that that's equivalent. We were thinking the people who might be able to man those kiosks would be the recovered patients.
So he's talking about the drive-through swab stations, right? Where nobody's going to be in contact with one another. You drive through, somebody would swab you, they do the test, and you drive off. Okay. And now he's saying with the self-swab, people can now swab themselves. And he says they had initially envisioned that the immune people would be manning those kiosks, the drive-through swab sections. So here's what he says.
Because they could give the test, like one a minute versus somebody who had to change their protective gear, which is also in short supply, would take like 20 minutes per test. Now that we have the self-swab, we don't need it for that. But you're right. Recovered people are kind of magical. And
they're magical. They have an aura. The recovered people have a glow about them. They glow. It's sort of like an orangey, yellowy, orangey glow about the recovered people.
For key jobs, even where you might have some exposure, it might be useful.
Okay, so that part was taken out.
Now, we don't want to have a lot of recovered people.
Okay, so what he's actually done is if I just move this back, right? I just moved it. And I'm going to kill the audio here. So now we're just going to listen to what that interview became. Okay, now just watch.
And showed FDA that that's equivalent. We were thinking the people who might be able to man those kiosks.
Hang on, I'm just going to hide the title so that it doesn't show up over his...
Effectively immune?
Yes, until we came up with the self-swab and showed FDA that that's equivalent, we were thinking the people who might be able to man those kiosks would be the recovered patients. Now, we don't want to have a lot of recovered people,
Okay, did you see the little dissolve that they watched?
Kiosks would be the recovered patients. Now, we don't want to...
Okay, there's a dissolve, right? They had to put a dissolve in there because they've edited something out. And that's a sort of a discreet way to mask the fact that you've removed something. So I'm just going to put this back where it was. And we'll watch this again.
Type tasks that people could be trained to do to relieve the pressure there if we knew that they were effectively immune.
And I'm putting back the audio from the original, which is here.
Yes, until we came up with the self-swab and showed FDA that that's equivalent, we were thinking the people who might be able to man those kiosks would be the recovered patients, because they could give the test, like one a minute versus somebody who had to change their protective gear, which is also in short supply, would take like 20 minutes per test. Now that we have the self-swab, we don't need it for that. But you're right. Recovered people are kind of magical. And, for key jobs, even where you might have some exposure, it might be useful. Now, we don't want to have a lot of recovered people.
Okay, so obviously there's no dissolve, there's no nothing, because it was just the full stream of consciousness. He's just speaking.
To be clear, we're trying through the shutdown in the United States to not get to 1% of the population infected.
What he's trying to say is he's trying to avoid people getting the disease so that they don't build up the immunity. So that then there's a forced need, or shall we say an artificial need, to protect people with the vaccine.
We're well below that today, but with exponentiation, you could get past that 3 million. I believe we will be able to avoid that with the having this economic pain.
The economic pain, with having this economic pain. I am blown away by the way this man expresses himself.
Eventually, what we'll have to have is certificates of who's a recovered person, who's a vaccinated person, because who's a recovered person, who's a vaccinated person.
Did you hear that? You'll have to have a certificate. Who's a recovered person and who's a vaccinated person. What?
Because you don't want people moving around the world where you'll have some countries that won't have it under control. Sadly, you don't want to completely block off the ability for those, people to go there and come back.
You don't want to completely stop people from moving around because they may or may not have gotten sick at some point. Actually, he's not even he's referring to someone who would have contracted the disease and built up their own immunity. And the only other group of people are the people who got vaccinated. So it's like black or white. There's no, well, no, I haven't had it yet, and no, I haven't been vaccinated, but I'm fine. That group doesn't exist anymore. And so he's talking about having the certificate for those two groups, and those two groups only, as some sort of tool related to allowing people to move around. And here's the famous section that got deleted.
To move around. So eventually there will be sort of this digital immunity proof that will help facilitate the global reopening up.
Wow, that's just excellent use of English, isn't it? To facilitate the global reopening up. So he's basically saying that if life is ever to become normal again, meaning we can begin to move around again, we're going to have this digital immunity proof on us to show that you are not a danger to people, okay? And you're seeing what the TED people chose to not show. Let's look at this section.
Really knowing who has the unique capabilities of doing things. And, so an organization that's working on this all the time, lots of new vaccines, can step in and be helpful. And it's really amazing when we talk to private sector partners, their interest in helping out has been absolutely fantastic.
He's talking about developing the vaccines, working with private sector partners and everything, and then so he's talking about how vaccines would be produced. Look at the part that they cut out.
Unique role. We also do a lot of the modeling, and so the idea of getting, the imperial model that people know has some negative assumptions in it that I hope are not right and aren't, wouldn't allow China to do as well as they want. So getting people to see, okay, what are these modeling telling us? Getting people scared enough, which, hey,
did you hear that?
Getting people scared enough, which, hey, the imperial model was very good at that, but not, so concerned that, hey, can we ever do an opening up?
Right, you want to scare people, but not too much.
Which that would be pretty mind-blowing if you had to wait until you had a vaccine.
Right, because everyone is talking about how it would take 18 months to be able to develop a vaccine and whatnot and all the modeling. But what he's saying here, and this is what I wanted to point out to you, is he's saying that in addition to everything else this man has his fingers in, he also is involved with the modeling, which I showed in my previous video, that the Johns Hopkins people are all over it with the modeling, etc. And then you find out that they removed the fact that he's openly saying that they also are doing the modeling data. Right? So when he's communicating, oh, we need this because deaths are going to rise and the peak, we haven't hit the peak yet, it's because his people are modeling the data as well. He's all over this thing.
Then, food supply, electricity, a lot of things are very difficult to maintain.
Meaning you can't go back to work, right? There's essential sectors that need to keep the lights on, right? You need electricity, things like that. But
And so that anyway, the countries like South Korea and China, those are positive data points on the idea that you can damp infections to tiny numbers.
So he's actually saying in a section that was removed, it's not as dramatic as you might think, and they cut that out. Sorry if I'm getting upset, but this just is so... just thought this was a really great way to show you people my rationale, what I was trying to do with this video, show you a little bit the process of how how I went about doing it. And I wanted you to see it all. Seeing is believing, basically. And even seeing, sometimes it is still unbelievable when you see it. So I will let you go through the video at your own pace. This is what you're seeing. You're seeing the gaps, and the gaps filled in with texts. My next video, I think I have 2 videos that I'm going to be working on, and one of them is to tell you about this TED group and the change.org group, and how these structures that are like touchy-feely, good, warm, kind of, oh, we're community, and isn't this great, we're taking steps for a better future, and it's all BS, people. It's all BS, and there's ulterior motives behind them, and I'm going to expose all of this in another video. So that's that. So I hope you will enjoy this idiot prattling on and on with his ums and his ahs and his sick laughing in inappropriate places. And I hope you'll leave your comments below, that you'll like my video and share the link, because I'm trying to get people to come back to my little channel. And I'm just so happy that you guys are out there watching my videos and interacting with me again. It really, really, really means a lot to me, and I want you to know that. So, having said that, enjoy the interview, guys. And this is Cerebra Sada signing off from Paris. Bye, everybody.
Hello and welcome to everyone joining us from around the globe. Thank you for being part of day 2 of our special series, TED Connects. This week, we're bringing you interviews from some of the world's greatest minds to offer tools for us to navigate through and thrive in these really uncertain times. I'm Whitney Pennington Rogers, TED's Current Affairs Curator, and I'll be one of your hosts for today's event. Yesterday, we kicked off this series with an interview from acclaimed psychologist Susan David, who offered us some tips on how to really be our best selves in these trying times. And we're going to switch gears a little bit today from thinking about our own personal mental health to the state of our global public health systems, especially as we're going through this global pandemic. So the way this will work is that we want all of you to really take part in this conversation. So please leave your comments your questions rather, in the comments thread on our Facebook page. I'm going to disappear for a few minutes, and that's because I'm working with our team behind the scenes to monitor that feed on Facebook and come up with some of the questions that we can bring to our guest. And I will come back to do that and try and share as many of those questions as I can. But for right now, I'd like to hand things over to my co-host, the head of TED, Chris Anderson, who's joining us from his home in New York.
Hey there, Whitney, nice to see you.
Hey there, Chris, nice to see you too.
I guess you're across the river, right? You're in Jersey?
That's right, yeah, I'm in Jersey. It's interesting how we're experiencing this a little differently, just a few miles apart.
Indeed. Well, we get to be on camera, and then behind the scenes, there's another whole crowd from TED working the tech magic and so forth. We're all reinventing how to do this stuff virtually as we go. But it's a pleasure working with you, Whitney. Thank you. I guess we have a pretty exciting guest to introduce. On the other side of the country, let's bring in Bill Gates. Bill, they say the better known people are, the less you have to intro them. So it's great to have you here. How are you doing?
Well, I think this is an unprecedented, really disconcerting time for everyone, with things being shut down, not knowing exactly how long it's going to last, worrying about the health of all the people we care about. I'm lucky that I get to connect up with video conferencing using Teams a lot, so that, Foundation is stepping up, and there's a lot of great people trying to help with this crisis. But it's scary for everyone.
Are you basically stuck at home like many of us watching?
Yeah, almost all my meetings are using Teams now. I'm getting used to that. I've gone days without seeing any co-workers.
Teams is good. Zoom seems to be good. Blue Jeans seems to be good. It's amazing seeing this explosion of virtual technology. I mean, that's a whole separate conversation we're not really going to talk about. But I really feel like our lives are being digitally reconfigured as we talk. It's kind of It's strange. It's also exciting in some ways. But look, let's start here, Bill. 5 years ago, you stood on the TED stage, and you gave this chilling warning that the world was in danger at some point of a major pandemic. People watching that talk now, the hair stands up in the back of their neck. It is exactly what we're living through. What happened? Did people listen to that warning at all?
Basically, no. I was hopeful that with the Zika and Ebola and SARS and MERS, none of which spread to a lot of countries, but they all reminded us that particularly in a world where people move around so much, you can get huge devastation. And so the talk was to say, hey, we're not ready for the next pandemic, but in fact, there's advances in science that if we put resources against them, we can be ready. Sadly, very little was done. There were some things. The Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, was funded by our foundation, Wellcome Trust, and a number of governments to do some of the platform vaccine work. But in the area of diagnostics, antibodies, antivirals, basically doing the disease games that I talked about where we'd simulate what needed to be done, we hardly did anything. And so now here we have a respiratory virus that is sadly fulfilling some of the more negative predictions I made.
I mean, last month you said that this might be the big one. You wrote that this could be the sort of once in a century pandemic that people had been fearing. Is that how you think of it still?
Well, it's awful to say this, but we could have a respiratory virus whose case fatality rate was even higher. If this was something like smallpox, that kills 30% of people. So this is horrific. But, in fact, most people, even who get the COVID disease, are able to survive. And, so in that, it's quite infectious, way more infectious than MERS or SARS were. It's not as fatal as they were. And yet the disruption we're seeing in order to knock it down is really completely unprecedented. So this is it's going global. It's respiratory. That was the great fear. How many people end up dying? Hopefully, if we do the right things, it won't be a gigantic number. So it's, we should end up not having a 1918 flu situation. We should be able to do a lot better than that.
And that's because of actions that we would take. I mean, left without the right actions, the prospects are pretty deadly. I mean, if we knew what we knew in 1919, this thing could take out many tens of millions of people around the world. Because, like you said, is the key thing here that it's got this sort of strange combination of being certainly more dangerous than flu, not as dangerous as something like Ebola or SARS, but more dangerous than flu by a factor, 5 or 6 or 7, right? Or, I'm not sure what the exact number is, but the but infectious and also infectious before symptoms have started. Is that part of why it's been really hard to respond to?
Right. So Ebola, you're actually flat on your back before you're very infectious. So you're not at church or in a bus or at a store. With most respiratory viruses like the flu and COVID, at first you only feel a little bit of a fever and a little bit sick. And so there's the possibility you're going about your normal activities and infecting other people. And so, human-to-human transmissible respiratory viruses that in the early stage aren't stopping you from doing things, that's kind of a worst case. And that's where, I did a flu simulation in the 2015 talk and showed how quickly it spread. Versus 1918, people move around a lot more now than they used to. And so that works against us. Now, the medical system that steps up to treat people is also far, far better. So those two work in different directions.
But when was it clear to you that that unless we acted, this could be a really deadly pandemic?
Well, in January, it was discussed that there was human-to-human transmission taking place. And so, the alarm bells were ringing that this fits the pattern, the very scary pattern, that it will be very difficult to contain. And on January 23rd, China did their equivalent of the shutdown, did it in a fairly extreme form. The very good news is that they were able to reduce the infection rates dramatically because of those actions. But it's January where everybody should have been on notice. Let's get our act together with testing. Let's get going on therapeutics and vaccines. We've got to get organized because we have this novel respiratory virus whose infectiousness and fatality put it in that super scary range.
And so what did happen? Because it's such a mystery to me about the sort of the lost month of preparation. Certainly, I mean, in many countries, and certainly in the US, where we are. Were you on the phone to people during early February, late January, early February, saying, guys, what's going on? This is a really big deal. What are we doing? What was happening behind the scenes during that period?
Well, you'd like to have government money show up for the key activities. We put out $100 million. We created the Therapeutics Accelerator. I think there's the period before this shows up where we should have done more. There's the period between when we realized it was transmitting and now where we should have done more. I think the most important thing to discuss today is that in the area of testing, we're still not creating that capacity and applying it to the people most in need. And so we have health workers who are symptomatic, who can't get a test, and so they don't know should they go in and not go in. And yet we have lots of tests being given to people who aren't symptomatic. And so the testing thing, to me, it's got to be organized, it's got to be prioritized. That is super, super urgent. The second thing is the isolation that, various parts, just focusing on the US, some parts are doing that in a fairly strong way and other parts not yet. And what's clear is the sooner, it's very hard to do, it's tough on people, it's disastrous for the economy, but the sooner you do it in a tough way, the sooner you can undo it and go back to normal.
So we'll come to the isolation part in a minute, but just sticking with the testing thing, I'm just so confused as to why, with more than a month's notice, I mean, there are so many smart epidemiologists in the US, for example. You plug numbers about infectiousness and fatality into any simulation, and you see that if you don't do anything, millions of people will die. And there's a month. So what's your explanation for what do you think happened here as to why there was almost no test? A month later, there was no viable test in the US. Was this just government complexity, too many chefs in the kitchen? Was there a top-down direct? What on earth happened here?
Well, we certainly didn't take advantage of the month of February. The good news is that the actual process, the PCR machines, we have a lot in the United States. And so there's models like South Korea who took advantage of February, built up the testing capacity, and they were able to contact trace and their infections have gone down even without the type of shutdown that because we're late, we're having to do. One thing that is good news just this week is that people had thought to do this test that you had to have a nurse or doctor shove a swab way up all the way to the back of your throat, which hurts a lot, but also you're going to cough and potentially spread the disease to that healthcare worker. So they have to have protective equipment and change that. What we sent data to the FDA this weekend showing that just a individual by themselves swabbing up to the tip of their nose, they're able, the accuracy of that test is essentially the same as having a healthcare worker do it. So what we call self-swab was in the press conference on Monday. That helps a lot. We still have to do other things, but that means that you don't have to change protective equipment. You just hand the patient that swab, they do it, put it in the test tube, and if the capacity's right, within 24 hours, you should get that result back.
So how do you see that playing out? Are there people going to massively scale those tests, and how will ordinary citizens be able to get hold of them? Does it still have to be actually kind of prescribed by a doctor at some point, or at some point will you be able to just order them off Amazon or something? And
well, it's pretty chaotic today because the government hasn't stepped in to make sure that the testing capacity is both increased and it's used for the right cases. There'll be a website, and if the federal government doesn't do it, a lot of local governments will have to do it, that you go to, you give your situation, including your symptoms. You're told, based on your work and your symptoms, are you a priority? If so, you're told where there are kiosks you can go to, and you'll do the self-swab and just hand it over. Or eventually, we'll send the kits to you at home, and then you'll send it back and hear that result. Maybe 6 months from now, you'll actually be able to you have a strip where you perform the test in the home. But for now, sending it back for the PCR processing, we can have massive capacity there. And that's how you know the testing is everything, because that's how you know whether you need to do more shutdown or you're starting to get to the point where you can relieve it. So you're blind when you have just randomly deciding who gets access to the testing capacity.
Some people are trying to argue now that almost the testing should be dialed back because the cat is out of the bag. Testing is bringing people together and risking infection. Forget that. Let's just focus on treatment and on isolation strategies. You disagree with that? Testing is still absolutely essential and needs to be scaled dramatically.
Well, the two that go together are testing at very high volume and the isolation piece. If you're a medical worker, you want to stay and do your job. If you're making sure the electricity, water, food is still available, you want to do your job. And so testing is what indicates to you, do you need to go into isolation and make sure you're not the source of spread? And so, testing is the key thing. South Korea did that in this massive way that, everybody should learn from. And so that is paired with the isolation piece. Our goal here is to get to the point where a very small percentage of the population is infected. China, only 0.01% of the population was infected. If you don't do these things, you're going to get to the majority of people infected and that huge overload of the medical system.
Whitney has some questions from our online audience. Whitney.
Hey there, Bill. So we have right now over 20,000 people watching this live. And some of the questions that we're seeing are about how our tech giants and leaders can play a role in isolating this and containing this virus.
Well, the thing that's a message for everyone is to, unless you're a critical infrastructure worker that you're mainly at home, and so that the spread across households is dropped to be very, very low. Within a household, that you may have spread there, but you don't want to cross over into other households. The actual, the tech companies are very involved in making sure that some work can go on. People can stay in touch. They can help with some of the disease modeling. They can help with the visibility of the numbers. It's actually very impressive. You get up there and you can see, those numbers. Actually, they're sad numbers, but, everybody's able to monitor this thing. Back in 1918, they didn't have this type of visibility and ability to share best practices. But for a lot of people, the isolation is the key thing. It's the healthcare workers are feeling the greatest pressure because the system will be heavily loaded, even for non-COVID things, deciding which can be deferred, which can't be deferred. There's a lot of choices being made and a lot of heroes doing unbelievable work.
Great, thank you. And I'll come back later with some other questions. I'll keep monitoring that.
I mean, Bill, one of the riddles about this isolation strategy is how long it has to last, right? Like a lot of people are concerned that the price of victory by isolating everyone is that you crash the economy, and that we have to be basically at home, not doing our regular jobs for 3-6 months, maybe all year. And so much so that there's now this big debate in the US and other countries about this may just be the wrong strategy, that we can't crash the economy that badly. We should only isolate for another couple of weeks and then let people back. And if that means, a lot of other people get sick and we eventually build up herd immunity, that may be the right way to go. What's your thought on this? Is it possible to find a middle way? What is the isolation strategy that eventually leads to us getting back to normal?
There really is no middle ground. And it's very tough to say to people, hey, keep going to restaurants, go buy new houses. Ignore that pile of bodies over in the corner. Just, we want you to keep spending because there's some maybe a politician who thinks GDP growth is what really counts. It's very hard to tell people when there's an epidemic spreading that threatens particularly their parents or elderly people that they know, that they should go about things knowing that their activity is spreading this disease. I don't know of any rich countries that have chosen to use that approach. It is true, if you did that approach over a period of several years, enough people would be infected, you'd have what's called herd immunity. But herd immunity is meaningless until you infect over half the population. And so you'll overload your medical system, so your case fatality rate, instead of being 1%, will be like 3-4%. And so, the idea, it's very irresponsible for somebody to suggest we can have the best of both worlds. What we need is the extreme shutdown so that in 6 to 10 weeks, if things go well, then you can start opening back up.
So just putting the math together from what you just said, Bill, to get to herd immunity, you need more than half the people in the country to basically get the bug. So in the case of the US, for example, that would be 150 million people thereabouts. You said that there could be the fatality rate in that scenario could be 3 to 5%. You're talking about 4 to 5 million people in that potential fatalities. I mean, it's that's just a horrifying scenario that no one should be contemplating. And even
right.
a tenth of that horrifying is horrifying.
Is doing the shutdown to drop the infections and try and avoid even 1% of their population getting sick. They will treat whoever goes for this ignore the disease strategy. They will treat them as a pariah state. So none of their people will go in, and none of your people will go into that. And so briefly, a few countries in Europe that hadn't really looked at this hard considered, okay, should we be the ones who kind of go about business as usual. It is tempting because if you got there early, South Korea did not have to do the extreme shutdown because they did such a good job on testing. And, that's why it's so
testing and containment.
maddening to me that the government's not allocating the testing to where it's needed. And maybe that'll have to happen at the state level because it's not happening at the federal level. But there is no middle course on this thing. It is sad that the shutdown will be harder for poorer countries than it is for richer countries.
So let's come to that in a minute. But just the one exception I've heard the case made for is Japan. That Japan has not contained it quite in the same way that South Korea did, but has allowed people to work. It's tried to make extreme measures for protecting their most elderly population, but they've tried to sort of they've tried to find a middle scenario, haven't they?
Well, if you act when you have hundreds of cases, you may be able to contain it by doing great testing and great contact tracing and restricting foreigners coming in without as much damage to your economy. And so the people who use February well, which include Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, they, right now, it looks like are not going to have lots and lots of cases. The U.S. has passed this opportunity to control without shutdown. We need to shut down so that the worst case of what was happening in Wuhan in the beginning or in northern Italy, over the last few weeks, that we avoid that. But we did not act fast enough to have an ability to avoid the shutdown.
But then what I don't understand, in the case of the US, for example, is that even if we're successful in bending the curve and reducing the number of new cases from a period of extreme shutdown, as it were, no immunity has been built up. Let's say that there's still no vaccine. Surely when you lift restrictions and people start going back to work, the whole thing just blows up again.
The experience that we're seeing in China and in South Korea is that there are not these people who are asymptomatic that are causing lots of infections. And that's a parameter that as you build the model, you have to put in. If there's an imperial model that people talk about a lot, which shows that reopening is very hard to do, but the results of that model are not matching what we see in China. And so very likely there aren't as many of these infecting asymptomatics. And that's why you have to be pragmatic. There's a lot we don't know. For example, seasonality may help us in the Northern Hemisphere. The force of infection will, respiratory viruses, to some degree, they all are seasonal. We don't know how seasonal this one is, but there's a reasonable chance that the force of infection will be going down. And it's your testing that always is telling you, oh my gosh, do I have to shut down more? Or can I start to open up? So particularly right as you open up, that testing and contact tracing is saying to you, and you can say I'm on the more optimistic side that it will be possible to do what China's doing, where they are starting to go back to normal.
And help me understand what happened there, because it seems kind of miraculous to me, because this virus was exploding, yes, in Wuhan, but people moved from there to many other parts of China. How is it possible that the combination of the shutdown in Wuhan and measures elsewhere seem to have got to the point where there are literally no new cases happening? I mean, to me, that implies that literally the virus is not circulating at all between humans in China. There's a few tourists coming in who they deal with, but I mean, how on earth, is that literally your interpretation of what happened? That it's no longer circulating in China?
What you should do is take a spreadsheet and take a number like 4. One person affects 4 people, and say the cycle, is every 10 days. go through, 8 of those cycles, and you're getting a big number. Start with 10,000, and then, that increase. If you take the number 0.4 instead, that is the average case infects 0.4 people, which then look at what happens to that number as you go out. It drops to 0. And so things that are exponential are very, very dramatic. When they're above 1, they are growing rapidly. When they're below 1, they're shrinking rapidly. And so the isolation in China drove that reproductive number to well below 0. And so local infection rates...
Below 1.
Below 1, sorry. And it's that quarantine, quarantine comes from 40 days, which is what they thought would help for Black Plague. That is our primary technique. Thank God we have testing if we use it properly. We are, doing therapeutics, which will help with the death rate. But in terms of the keeping infections below 1% of the population, it's really all depends just on the 2 things, isolation and testing.
So, to quote a question from my Twitter feed this morning for you, Bill, like if you were president for a month in the US, what would you do? What would be the top 2 or 3 things you would do?
Well, the clear message that we have no choice to maintain this isolation, and that's going to keep going for a period of time, probably in the Chinese case, it was like 6 weeks. So we have to prepare ourselves for that and do it very well, and then use the testing and every week talk about what's going on with that. If you're doing isolation well, within about 20 days, you'll see those numbers really change. Instead of this, you'll see this. And that is a sign that you're on your way. Now you have to stay to get those more generations that are, 0.4 infections per previous infection. You have to maintain it for a number of weeks there. And, so this is not going to be easy. We need a clear message about that. It is really tragic that the economic effects of this are very dramatic. I mean, nothing like this has ever happened to the economy in our lifetimes. But money, bringing the economy back and doing money, that's more of a reversible thing than bringing people back to life. And so we're going to take the pain in the economic dimension, huge pain, in order to minimize the pain in the disease and death dimension.
Whitney.
So we have a lot of other questions coming in. One of the ones that we've been seeing is this question about what tools are available for countries that maybe don't have the luxury of being able to social distance, don't have great health systems in place. How should they be handling this virus?
Yeah, I would say that if the rich countries really do their job well, by the summer, they'll be like China is, or some of the other countries that responded early. But in the developing countries, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, this seasonality is large. As you say, the ability to isolate, when you go out to get your food every day, you have to earn your wage. When you live in a slum where you're very nearby each other, it's very hard to do. Modi in India today said, hey, he wants India to do it, and I hope it works, but I think it's way more difficult as you move down the income ladder than it is for a country like the United States. And so we should all, accelerate the vaccine, which eventually will come, and, people are being responsible to say that, that's going to take 18 months. And there's a lot of those being pursued. I'm talking a lot with Seth Berkley, who you're going to have later this week, who can talk a lot about the vaccine front, because he's definitely at the center of that, at being the head of Gavi. We do need to get really cheap testing out to these countries, and we need to get therapeutics so you don't need to put 5% of people on respirators, because even if they had the equipment, they don't have the personnel. They just don't have the beds, the capacity. And so the only good news is that the rich countries have this, and so they will be learning about testing therapeutics and funding the vaccines for the entire world to try and minimize the damage in developing countries.
Great. I'll be back later with more questions.
Bill, you mentioned therapeutics there. What is looking promising? Is anything looking promising?
Yeah, so there's quite a range of things going on. There's a few that get mentioned a lot. Remdesivir, hydrochloroquine, azithromycin. And the data is still a bit confusing, but there's some positive data on those. Remdesivir is a 5-day IV infusion and actually kind of hard to manufacture. So people are looking at how that can be improved. The hydrochloroquine looks like it works somewhat if you get in early. There are a huge list of compounds, including antibodies, antiviral drugs. And so the Gates Foundation and Wellcome Trust, with support from MasterCard and now others, created this therapeutic accelerator to really triage out. You have hundreds of people showing up and saying, try this, try that. So we look at lab assays, animal models, and so we understand which things should be prioritized for these very quick human trials that need to be done all over the world. And so the coordination on that is very complex globally. But I think, out of the top 20 or so candidates, probably 3 or 4 of them will work out, at different stages of the disease to reduce the respiratory distress.
I heard you mention that one possibility might be treatments from the serum, the blood serum of people who had the disease and recovered. So I guess they're carrying antibodies. Talk a bit about that, about how that could work and what it would take to accelerate that.
Yeah, this has always been discussed, is how could you pull that off? So people who are recovered, it appears, have really effective antibodies in their blood. So you could go transfuse them and only take out the white cells, the immune cells. And then the question is, okay, how many patients worth of material could you get? If you have that recovered person come in, say, once a week, do you get enough for 2 people or 5 people? Then logistically, you have to take that and get it to where that need is. And so it's fairly complicated. Compared to a drug that we can make in high volume, the cost of taking it out and putting it back in probably doesn't scale as well. But there is work being done on this. We actually started with Ebola. Unfortunately, it got done before it was needed. So that is being pursued, and it'll work to some degree, but it'll be hard to scale the numbers.
So it's almost like when you talk about the need to accelerate testing, the immediate need, and I don't know if we've lost. Oh, there you are. You're back. Sorry, we lost you briefly. The immediate need is for testing for the virus. But is it possible that in a few months' time that there's going to be this growing need to test for these antibodies in people, i.e. to see if someone had the disease and recovered? Maybe they didn't even know they had it. Because you could picture this growing worldwide force of heroes, let's call them heroes, who've been through this experience and have a lot to offer the world. Maybe they can offer, like blood donation, serum donation, but also other tasks. Like if you've got overwhelmed healthcare systems, presumably there are kind of community health worker type tasks that people could be trained to do to relieve the pressure there, if we knew that they were effectively immune.
Yes, until we came up with the self-swab and showed FDA that that's equivalent, we were thinking that people who might be able to man those kiosks would be the recovered patients, because they could give the test, like 1 a minute, versus somebody who had to change their protective gear, which is also in short supply, would take like 20 minutes per test. Now that we have the self-swab, we don't need it for that, but you're right. Recovered people are kind of magical. And, for key jobs, even where you might have some exposure, it might be useful. Now, we don't want to have a lot of recovered people. To be clear, we're trying through the shutdown in the United States to not get to 1% of the population infected. We're well below that today, but with exponentiation, you could get past that 3 million. I believe we will be able to avoid that with the having this economic pain. Eventually, what we'll have to have is certificates of who's a recovered person, who's a vaccinated person, because you don't want people moving around the world where you'll have some countries that won't have it under control. Sadly, you don't want to completely block off the ability for those people to go there and come back and move around. So eventually there will be sort of this digital immunity proof that will help facilitate the global reopening up.
Bill, is your foundation helping to accelerate the manufacture of these self-test swabs, nasal swabs? Or how can we, what are the prospects for really seeing scale on some of this testing soon? Not just in the US, but globally.
Yeah, our foundation, we had been funding a thing called the flu study to really understand how respiratory viruses spread. It's amazing how little was understood about how important schools are, different age groups, different types of interaction. And that gave us an experience. In fact, that flu study actually was the first time coronavirus was found in the community, because the government was still saying you only test people who come from China. But we ran into people who had coronavirus who hadn't been travelers. So, that was like an early warning sign, even though the regulation said you weren't supposed to even look at that. So, the foundation is working with all the private sector people, the diagnostics people on this testing piece. Now that we can do the self-swab, those swabs are very easy to manufacture. The one where you had to jam it into the throat, deep turbinate, that was getting into short supply. So the swab, should not be limiting. Neither should the various chemicals that help run the PCR machine. So we should be able to get to a South Korea type prioritized testing thing within a few weeks.
How important is it that the world's nations collaborate right now? I mean, it's, it seems like, here's this common enemy facing humanity. It does not know that it just crossed a border. It does not know what race people are, what religion they are. It just knows, here's a human. I've got a manufacturing machine here that can make me famous, and it goes to work. It's so terrifying to me to see signs of countries starting to blame each other, or the xenophobia just seems so toxic. What's your take on this, Bill? Is there anything? Do you see signs of cooperation happening, or are you also worried about the sort of US versus China kind of thing that seems to be going on if we're not careful?
Well, I see both. I see that countries that are recovered can help other countries. And that, that's fantastic. If by the summer we've knocked this thing down, then great, we can help other countries. There are vaccine projects all over the world, and those should be evaluated on a very neutral basis to which one is the best to help humanity, and make sure the manufacturing capacity isn't just for rich countries, that it's scaled up, very low cost stuff for the entire world. And that's the spirit of Gavi, is getting vaccines out to every person. So you see it really good in the science side and data sharing side. You see this great cooperation going on. Unfortunately, whenever you have disease, this sense of other and foreign and oh, stay away from me, that sort of pulling inward is reinforced, and we have to avoid that. Ironically, we have to isolate physically, while in terms of looking at community groups that are pooling resources to help make sure food gets to everyone and help sure medical care, and that, if older people need to be moved out of common facilities, you help out with that, and that, people aren't suffering too much from the psychology of isolation. So our generosity has to go up towards others at the same time where we're less actually physically interacting with other people.
I mean, thinking about the situation in many developing countries, I'm curious how you think of this. I mean, you mentioned, first of all, that seasonality may help, i.e. high temperatures. It's possible that when this virus lands on a surface that is hot, it melts. Like that fat layer melts and it's no longer effective. Is it possible that is so far protecting to some extent places like India or sub-Saharan Africa and so forth?
Well, India's northern hemisphere. So southern hemisphere is lots of Africa, South America, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia. And it is true, either the force of infection is lower there, or we're just not seeing it with testing. A few months from now, we'll understand the seasonality question, which would be good news for the northern hemisphere and somewhat bad news for the southern hemisphere. Now, more people live in the northern hemisphere, including, India, Pakistan, and that would buy us some time. The time is a big deal because you get all these tools get so much better if you had to go into a second season with it. But yeah, sadly, we could see in the next few months, as the southern hemisphere is moving into its fall and then winter, we could see a big increase there. And that is going to be very difficult. Now, they don't have as many older people, but they have lots of people who who are HIV positive or have malnutrition or various lung challenges because of indoor smoke. And so the wild card is, how well can the developing countries deal with this?
I mean, if you're in a country where you have the majority of your populations making less than $2 or $3 a day, can you even afford a strategy that looks like basically shutting down the economy? Isn't there a real chance in that scenario that you lose far more deaths from hunger than from this virus?
Yeah, I mean, people will go out and seek food, and your safety net, your excess food production. We need very little of our workers to actually make the food that we eat, and we've got to make sure we do that well. But it's not that hard for rich countries, and so I'm impressed that India is acting on this. But I don't think they'll be able to reduce the inter-household spread nearly to the degree that a rich country who's doing their shutdown well. And so I'm very worried that, unless we get the new tools, or for the Northern Hemisphere countries, they get time from seasonality. I'm very worried that there will be a massive number of deaths in those poor countries because the health systems just aren't, the number of respirators, hospitals. And of course, when you overload that system, your deaths are not just COVID deaths, but everyone else who's trying to access a system that will be somewhat in chaos, including with health workers who are getting sick.
Okay, we're getting near to running out of time with this. Whitney, maybe a last question or two from online, and then
Sure,
I've got one to wrap up.
Sure. So we have two from online. We're seeing thousands of questions around these same lines. One, there's lots of people who are really interested to hear about the kind of work that you're doing with your foundation as far as distributing tests, but also producing safety gear, masks, and that sort of thing to help with this effort for health workers.
Yeah, so the Gates Foundation, we very early on gave out $100 million to help out with all the pieces, the testing piece, the therapeutics, and the vaccines. We are not experts in making masks and ventilators and gowns, and it's great that other people, including some 3D printing and open source things, that is great. Our focus, like this self-swab thing, nobody had done that before. People thought it wouldn't work. We were quite sure it would work. And so that for the globe is a huge thing, that the front end of testing can be this fairly simple swab that you don't infect health workers as you do it. And so, we're on the phone with we work a lot with both governments and private sector. So in some ways, we're kind of a bridge. So we've been talking to the head of the pharmaceutical companies and the testing companies, and specifically with the ones doing vaccines, including some of which are these new type of vaccines, RNA vaccines that we've been backing, for quite some time, and CEPI has been backing. And so our expertise is in those medical tools and really getting the best of the private sector engaged there. It's been a little slow. We can write checks, right away, whereas the government processes, even in this situation, there's still this notion of bidding and not really knowing who has the unique capabilities of doing things. And, so an organization that's working on this all the time, lots of new vaccines, can step in and be helpful. And it's really amazing when we talk to private sector partners, their interest in helping out has been absolutely fantastic. So that's where we have a unique role. We also do a lot of the modeling. And so the idea of getting, the imperial model that people know has some negative assumptions in it that I hope are not right and aren't, wouldn't allow China to do as well as they want. So getting people to see, okay, what are these modeling telling us? Getting people scared enough, which, hey, the imperial model is very good at that, but not, so concerned that, hey, can we ever do an opening up, which that would be pretty mind-blowing if you had to wait until you had a vaccine. I mean, that then, food supply, electricity, a lot of things are very difficult to maintain. So that, anyway, the countries like South Korea and China, those are positive data points on the idea that you can damp infections to tiny numbers.
That's great. And I mean, and the other question that we're just seeing a ton of before we wrap up here is just people are really interested in your insight, Bill, on whether you think we're heading in the right direction. Do you feel like our economy is heading in the right place, that humanity is heading in the right place? Are we in a better position now than you thought we were in 5 years ago?
Well, 5 years ago, I said that the pandemic is this unaddressed, very, very scary thing. And that, if we did the right things, we could be more prepared. Science is on our side. The fact we can be ready for the next epidemic, it's very clear how to do that. And yes, it will take tens of billions, but not hundreds or trillions of dollars. It'll be tiny compared to the economic cost. I remember when I did that presentation in 2015, I put up a big flu epidemic could cost $4 trillion. And I thought, wow, that's a big number. Do I really think it's that big? And I went and looked at the numbers. I thought, yeah, well, that's big. This epidemic will cost that much to the economy. So in the short run, we are going to have more pain and more difficulty, and people are going to have to step up to help each other. I'm still very much an optimist, whether it's climate change, countries working together, biology taking the diseases, malaria, TB, even advances for what are more ritual diseases like cancer. The amount of innovation, the way we can connect up and work together, yes, I'm super positive about that. I love my work because I see progress on all these diseases all the time. Now we have to, turn and focus on this. Sadly, it may interrupt, and the polio situation might get worse a little bit because of the distraction here. We're using a lot of the great capacity that was built up for those polio activities to try and help the developing countries respond to this very well, and that is appropriate. But the message for me, although it's very sober when we're dealing with this epidemic, I'm very positive that this should draw us together. We will get out of this, and then we will get ready for the next epidemic.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you, Bill, as almost as the the sort of, as we come to the end of this time, which is where's your head? Do you think we will get through this? I know that you're instinctively an optimist, and that science is capable of finding a way through here, but will the leaders that matter listen to the scientists? Will they? Will we make it through? Do you believe that within a few months' time, we're going to be already looking back and saying, we dodged a pretty bad one there?
We can't say for sure that even the rich countries will be out of this in 6 to 10 weeks. I think that's likely, but as we get the testing data, we'll get more of a sense of that, and people will continuously be able to see that. But, the rich countries will get out of this. The developing countries will bear a significant price, but even we will get a vaccine, and Gavi will get that out to everyone. So, 2 to 3 years from now, this thing, even on a global basis, will essentially be over with a gigantic price tag. But now we're going to know, okay, next time we see a pathogen, we can make billions of tests within 2 or 3 weeks. We can figure out which antiviral drugs work within 2 or 3 weeks and get those scaled up. And we can make a vaccine, if we're really ready, probably in 6 months, using these new platforms, probably the RNA vaccine. So specifically, there are innovations that are there that will get financed, I hope quite generously coming out of this thing. And so 3 years from now, we'll look back and say, that was awful. There's a lot of heroes, but we've learned the lesson. And the world as a whole, with its great science and desire to help each other, was able to try and minimize what happened there and avoid it happening again.
That's certainly the optimistic scenario that I'm craving for myself, that the world kind of realizes, one, that there are certain things that you just have to unite on. Two, that science really matters, and that it's a miracle that science can understand this bug, make a vaccine, sequence it, make therapeutics, understand how to model it. It's kind of miraculous to me. So will we learn now to pay attention to scientists? Because if we do, and I'm sure that you feel this as well, there's an amazing analog, right, with climate. It's just a different time scale, that the scientists are out there saying, there's this huge enemy coming. If we do nothing, it's going to take millions of lives. It's going to wreck our planet. For God's sake, act, politicians, do something. And the politicians are going, no, we need a little more GDP, we need to win an election, and they're not acting. Do you see a scenario where this shocks politicians to actually change their thinking and their prioritization of science overall, or is that asking too much?
Yeah, it's interesting how much of this distraction will delay the urgent innovation agenda that exists over in climate. I have freed up a lot of time to work on climate. I have to say, for the last few months, that's now shifted, and until we get out of this crisis, COVID will dominate, and so some of the climate stuff, although it'll still go on, it won't get that same focus. As we get past this, yes, that idea of innovation in science and the world working together, that is totally common between these two problems. And so I don't think this has to be a huge setback for climate. And in fact, I think it can be a helpful guide of non-scientists, where are you seeing disaster looming, and let's make sure that doesn't happen.
So last question, there are thousands of people watching, many of them living alone, some scared. There may even be people there who have this virus and suffering symptoms or recovering. By the way, if that's you, we'd love to hear from you. We really would. Maybe have a conversation with some of you, just in a future one of these, just understanding the experience. But Bill, what can you give to people who are out there? What can people do as individuals from their own homes right now to try and help?
Well, there's a lot of creativity. Can you mentor kids who are being forced into an online format where the school systems really weren't ready for that? Can you organize some giving activity that gets the food banks to step up where there's problems there? The U.S. has this tradition of philanthropy, tradition of civil society coming together. There's a few things the government needs to do, but most of the things that will moderate the pain, the isolation, the damage here, everyone can think how they jump into that. These are such unprecedented times, and it really should draw out that sense of creativity while complying with the isolation mandates.
Well, Bill, I really want to thank you for spending this time with us and for the financial investment, the time investment. You've really invested your life into trying to solve these big problems, and this is as big as they get. I have a hunch that your voice is really going to be needed in the next few weeks. There's so much, this is turning political in so many ways, and just what's desperately needed are people who can't be accused first and foremost of being political. They're just being smart. They're just being smart, and I hope you'll be able to use that voice and keep the US and others in the world on the right track here. But thank you so much for your time today. This was really wonderful hearing from you. Thank you.
No, thanks, Chris.
Whitney, do you want to come back? I think we should just close this out, and it's been I haven't had a chance to look at the comments, but it's just been great to have every one of you here joining us. I hope we covered most of the things you wanted to cover. I appreciate the advice, the tips from many of you that Chris Anderson should not be touching his face. I mean, this is so hard, the thing. I don't even know I'm doing this. It's like, the good news is I do wash my hands a lot, 20 seconds. I do have hand sanitizer.
I have seen your hand sanitizer. I've seen it. It exists, yes.
But we need to help each other. So thank you guys for reaching out and helping us. And I mean, we're planning to continue this. We're just going to be here certainly this week. I think next week. I think if you guys like it and tell us you like it, I think we'll just try and keep it going. We want your suggestions. We want you to be there for each other. This is about building community. There is, I believe, a real thing called the global TED community. You are part of it. You are making it real right now. In anything you can do to connect with each other, to offer advice to each other, to help us do this smarter, etc., etc. We're a group of people who believe in the future. We believe that the future can be shaped. That you make the right decisions now, it's going to make things okay. We believe that. You just have to be smart about it and to bring on people like Bill Gates and others. So we've got a pretty great lineup for the rest of the week. Whitney, who's coming tomorrow and Thursday and Friday?
Yeah, we're so excited. Huge thanks to Bill Gates today and Susan David yesterday. To tomorrow, we're going to have the CEO of the South China Morning Post, Gary Liu, with us. It'll be very late for him, same time for us, to give us some insight into how China has responded to this and what we all can learn from what happened there.
What's happened in China is so astonishing in so many ways. I mean, horrifying things, an amazing innovation, amazingly good things. And the fact that they've got from shocking numbers of people to 0 so far, hope it stays like that, is incredible. And it's going to be so interesting to hear from him tomorrow.
Yeah, I think he'll have a lot of really great things to share from a journalist perspective as well, sort of having that 30,000-foot view of what's happening in China and beyond.
Yeah, and then Thursday is Seth Berkley, who Bill mentioned, who runs Gavi. It's a global vaccine initiative that is right there at the heart of looking at the research, looking at the prospects of whether we can possibly accelerate it shorter than 18 months. 18 months is a very scary timetable to me for this, because I'm not certain that things can ever return to normal before we have that vaccine. But I'm excited for that.
Yeah, hopefully he'll have some positive and optimistic things to share with us. And then on Friday, we'll round out the week with Priya Parker, who is the author of the book, The Art of Gathering, and is really an expert on how we can connect with each other, and will share ways that we can do that as we're practicing social distancing and not really able to spend time physically together. which would be really helpful going into the weekend.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. Thanks for being part of the TED community. Look after yourselves. Be smart about this. You know, it's like, get ahead of it. If you're in a part of the world where this thing hasn't really hit, listen to Bill Gates. Get ahead of it. To keep, you know, just if you possibly can, socially distance, not physically distance, and socially connect. That's what the internet is for. These days are what the internet was built for. We can spread love, we can spread ideas, we can spread relationship, we can spread thought without spreading a dangerous bug. So get ahead of it and let's figure this out together. It's been wonderful spending time with you, from Whitney and from me and from the whole TED team. Thank you, and over and out.